I dialed my parents' number 9 times from a hospital bed where the doctors weren't entirely sure I'd survive the week. My mother let every single call die into silence because my sister needed an extra pair of hands hauling a sectional sofa into her new living room. I lay there with a clot lodged somewhere deep in my lung and a thin plastic line feeding oxygen into my nose, watching my screen go dark again and again, and understanding with each unanswered ring that the people who raised me were 25 minutes away, perfectly capable of coming, simply choosing not to. I run a company built entirely around showing up for people when they're at their most fragile. I never imagined I'd discover exactly who my family really was while I was the fragile one. So on the second day, I made one more call. Not to them. To my attorney. By the time my family finally walked through that hospital door, the consequences of ignoring me had already been signed, witnessed, and filed. My name is Carolyn Voss. I'm 36 years old, and I own a home healthcare agency in central Indiana, the kind of company that sends trained aides into people's living rooms when age or illness makes independence impossible. I started it with a single client and a borrowed car. Today it employs nearly 40 caregivers. There's a bitter irony I can't shake. I've spent my entire career making certain that frightened, vulnerable strangers are never left alone. And yet I had no idea, none, that my own blood would abandon me to that exact fate the first time I was the one in the bed. For weeks leading up to that Friday, something had felt wrong. I'd get winded climbing the stairs at my own office. A persistent ache had settled into my left calf that I kept blaming on a long highway drive. Being responsible, I saw my doctor. She examined my leg, frowned, used the words, possible clot, ordered imaging, and told me plainly to watch for chest pain or breathlessness. I nodded, scheduled a follow-up, and went straight back to my desk, because I am, and have always been, the dependable one. And dependable people don't have time to be patients. That label, the dependable one, had shaped my entire existence. My mother handed it to me when I was barely old enough to understand what it meant, and I wore it proudly for 3 decades before I finally recognized it for what it actually was, a quiet, permanent excuse for everyone else to never check on me. What none of them ever seemed to register, or perhaps simply chose not to, was that I was the financial backbone of this family. Not flashy, not loud about it, just structurally essential, like a support beam nobody bothers admiring because it's holding the ceiling up. I covered my parents' rent at an upscale assisted living community, the very one my mother loved boasting about to her bridge club as though she'd financed it herself. I'd listed them as primary beneficiaries on a substantial life insurance policy, because if something ever happened to me, I wanted them secure. That same month, I'd agreed to front the down payment on my younger sister Renee's new house, a home she and her husband Marcus couldn't have afforded on their own. I never once asked for gratitude. Being needed felt close enough to being loved that I'd stopped examining the difference years ago. Just a week before everything collapsed, my mother and I had spoken on the phone. I mentioned, almost in passing, that I was exhausted and waiting on more test results. She breezed right past it, the way she breezed past anything that wasn't about Renee or the grandchildren. "Oh, you're the strong one, Carolyn," she said, light and unbothered. "You'll be fine. You're always fine." I'd heard some version of that sentence my entire life and always taken it as praise. It would take an ICU bed to teach me it was actually a door quietly swinging shut, my mother deciding in advance that my needs simply didn't exist because she'd already filed me under doesn't need anything. I just didn't yet know how literally she meant it. It happened on a Friday morning, right at the scheduling board in my office, coffee cup in hand, sorting out weekend coverage for a client. The room tilted. Not dizziness, something heavier, like the air itself had thickened into something I couldn't pull into my lungs no matter how hard I tried. A vicious pain tore through my chest. The coffee cup slipped from my fingers and shattered, the sound arriving from somewhere impossibly far away. My office manager, Denise, who'd been with me since the early days, took one look at my face and was already dialing 911 before I'd finished sliding down the filing cabinet to the floor. I remember the cold tile against my cheek. I remember her voice eerily calm, reciting my age to the dispatcher, telling them I couldn't breathe. I remember thinking distantly that I'd trained her well. Then paramedics. An oxygen mask. A man with gentle eyes asking me to squeeze his hand, and the specific horror of trying to answer him and not having enough air left to form the words. As the ambulance doors sealed shut, somewhere between the siren and the strange floating sensation of suffocating slowly, one icy, lucid thought sliced through everything. I might die today. Me. The one who was always fine. The one everyone else leaned on. And the last thing I'd accomplish with my life might be solving someone else's weekend shift schedule. The emergency room moved with the kind of urgency that tells you, without anyone saying it, that this is serious. Scans. And 4-line. Voices trading clinical terms over my head. By the time anyone gave me a straight answer, I was already in intensive care, and a doctor with tired, honest eyes stood at the foot of my bed and told me the truth, because I'd asked her to. A pulmonary embolism. The clot that had been quietly building in my calf had broken free and lodged itself in my lung, and it was large. She didn't soften any of it. The next 48 hours, she said, were the dangerous window. They were giving me medication to stop it from growing, to stabilize me while they planned next steps. People survive this, she told me. She also told me gently that some didn't, and that I should call my family. Call my family. I lay there with the oxygen hissing and the monitor counting out my pulse, and I felt more alone than I had in my entire life. Not because no one was nearby, they were a 15-minute drive away, but because, for the first time, I genuinely wasn't certain they'd come. My hand trembled as I reached for the phone on the tray table. I told myself I was overreacting, that my mother would be tearing down the hallway within the hour, already scolding me for not calling sooner. I found her name. I pressed call. I waited to hear her voice promise me everything would be fine. 4 rings. Voicemail. Her familiar, cheerful greeting. I left a message, keeping it as short as my lungs would allow. Mom, it's me. I'm in the ICU. They found a clot in my lung. It's serious. Please call me back. I hung up and stared at the ceiling, inventing excuses. She's driving. She's in the shower. She left her phone in another room again. I gave it 10 minutes. Then I called my father. Same result, 4 rings. Then his slow, steady voicemail greeting. I left him an identical message, my voice noticeably thinner this time. I knew, somewhere underneath the panic, that it was moving day for Renee. My parents had promised to help carry boxes. But surely, a blood clot outranks a couch. Surely there exists some line, even in this family, where a medical emergency wins out over an errand. Over the following 2 hours, I called 5 more times, 3 to my mother, 2 to my father. Every single call rang out completely and dropped into voicemail. After the 6th attempt, I stopped leaving messages. There was nothing left worth repeating, and hearing my own frightened voice played back at me only made the silence louder. Then I made the mistake of opening our family group chat. It updated in real time before my eyes. My mother, active that very moment, posting photos. Renee's half-unpacked living room, boxes stacked toward the ceiling. My father, beaming and red-faced, hoisting one end of a couch. A row of laughing emojis. A caption from my mother. Best day ever. So proud of our girl and her gorgeous new home. Our girl. If you're watching this and you've ever felt invisible while your family celebrated without you, if you've ever watched, in real time, proof that you weren't the priority you'd spent a lifetime being for them, I want you to know that it has a name, and it deserves to be spoken aloud. Drop a comment below with the name of the one person who would have dropped everything to come if it had been you in that bed. I read every single one. Back in my room, I set the phone face down on the tray, and for the first time since the ambulance ride, the fear drained out of me. Something colder, something far clearer, moved in to take its place. My phone buzzed once more that afternoon. My heart leapt for a half-second, certain it was finally my mother. It was a text from Renee. She'd clearly scrolled past my earlier messages, the ones describing the ICU, the seriousness of it all, and this is what she sent. OMG, so busy with the move today, but glad you're being looked after. Rest up, talk soon. Glad you're being looked after. As though I'd checked into a spa retreat. As though the team of strangers monitoring my vitals were an indulgence I'd treated myself to, rather than the only thing standing between me and the worst possible outcome. I read it 3 times, waiting for a follow-up. Wait, the hospital? Are you okay? I'm coming, but it never arrived. In the span of one breezy sentence, Renee had decided my crisis was handled, that being looked after by professionals absolved her of showing up herself. And the part that hurt most was realizing she'd learned this from somewhere. She'd inherited it, watching our mother treat me as the daughter who was permanently, conveniently fine. There was one number left I hadn't tried. My younger brother, Theo. 30 years old, a shop teacher 2 towns over, the baby of the family who'd somehow drifted outside the gravitational pull that organized the rest of us. Not the golden child, not the workhorse. Just plainly, uncomplicatedly kind in a way none of the rest of us had ever managed. I almost didn't call. Old habits whispered that I shouldn't interrupt his afternoon, shouldn't be a burden. But exhaustion and fear finally outweighed pride. He answered on the second ring. Theo, I managed, my voice finally breaking. I'm in the hospital. He didn't ask a single clarifying question. Not what happened, not how serious, not whether it could wait. He simply said, which hospital? I'm coming right now, and hung up before I could tell him not to bother. 40 minutes later, he walked through my door still in his work clothes, sawdust dusting his jeans, his face pale with worry. He crossed the room, took my hand in both of his, and said, I'm here. I've got you. I'm not leaving. I cried for the first time since the ambulance. Not from fear of dying, but because for 36 years I had been the one who showed up for everyone else, and I hadn't realized, until that exact second, what it felt like to have someone show up for me. It was like setting down a weight I'd carried so long I'd forgotten it had mass. Theo stayed. He called his school for a substitute. He slept upright in the stiff vinyl chair beside my bed, waking every time a nurse came in at 3 in the morning just to make certain everything was still okay. By the second day, the medication was working. My oxygen levels climbed steadily. The immediate danger eased, though full recovery was still far off. And somewhere in that long, quiet night, clear-headed for the first time in days, I did what I've always done best. I took an honest inventory. I thought about the monthly payments funding my parents' apartment. I thought about the insurance policy bearing their names. I thought about the down payment sitting in escrow for Renee's house, money I'd promised before I understood what I now understood. I thought about 9 unanswered calls, a couch, a heart emoji, and the phrase glad you're being looked after. I wasn't angry, not exactly. Anger runs hot. This was cold, the quiet clarity of a ledger finally balancing correctly. For 36 years I'd given them the benefit of every doubt, filled every silence with generous explanations on their behalf. In 48 hours, they'd show me precisely where I ranked. Beneath a move, beneath a sofa, beneath the comfort of believing I never needed anyone. I looked over at Theo, asleep in that awful chair, his hands still resting near mine, and understood something simple and devastating. I had spent my whole life pouring myself into people who would never come, while stepping right past the one person who always did. That was about to change. And I knew exactly how to make it permanent. The next morning sealed it. I woke to the group chat lighting up again. My mother, bright and early, posting a photo of Renee's fully unpacked kitchen. All moved in. Pizza for everyone last night. What a weekend. So blessed. I scrolled back through 2 full days of messages. Boxes, couches, grandchildren, pizza. Not a single mention of me. Not one. My name hadn't appeared in my own family's conversation in 48 hours while I lay in intensive care 15 minutes from where they'd eaten that pizza. I set the phone down on the white blanket. I expected fury. Instead, I felt the opposite. A calm so total it was almost peaceful, the way an equation finally resolves itself into one clean, undeniable number. They had told me in every way available to them exactly what I was worth when I had nothing left to offer. So I would simply update my records to match their answer. That's the only kind of revenge a person who keeps the books of her own heart ever really takes. Not destruction. Accuracy. I picked up the phone again. I didn't open the group chat. I didn't call my mother. I scrolled to a different name entirely, the one person I trusted absolutely with the things that mattered. Marcus Whitfield, no relation to my brother-in-law, just an unfortunate coincidence of surnames, had been my attorney since my company's 2nd year, the man who drafted my contracts and, 3 years prior, my estate documents. Careful, steady, the kind of man who'd talked me out of more than one impulsive decision over the years. So when he picked up and I calmly told him what I wanted, there was a long pause on the line. I explained everything. The clot, the ICU, the 9 unanswered calls, the pizza. I told him I wanted new beneficiaries, a rewritten will, the assisted living payments halted, and the down payment for Renee's house formally withdrawn before it could clear. I wanted it done properly, and I wanted it done now from this bed. He asked the question I'd have been disappointed if he hadn't. Carolyn, I'll do whatever you ask, but as your lawyer and your friend, I need to know, is this a decision, or is this a wound talking? They can look identical from a hospital bed, and I don't want you undoing this in a month. I gave him the truest answer I had. I've spent 36 years giving these people the benefit of the doubt. The last 2 days, they finally answered the question I never let myself ask out loud. This isn't hurt talking. This is me finally believing them. He said he'd be there within the hour, and that we'd do this exactly right. I knew from years of working alongside attorneys that the documents themselves mattered less than the question someone would eventually raise. Was she even in her right mind? People contesting an inheritance love nothing more than claiming the signer was confused, medicated, manipulated, not herself. I refused to leave that door open even a crack. So before Marcus arrived, I asked to speak with my attending physician, the same doctor who'd been honest with me from the start. I explained my plan and asked her, plainly, to confirm in writing that I was alert, oriented, and fully capable of making legal and financial decisions. She studied me for a long moment, the look one exhausted, competent woman gives another, and said yes. My labs were stable, my oxygen was good, my mind was clear, and in her professional judgment, I had full capacity. She offered to note it in my chart and witness the signing herself. I told her it would help more than she could know. My night nurse, a no-nonsense woman named Patricia with reading glasses on a beaded chain, agreed to serve as the second witness. I'd watched her run that ward for 2 straight nights with a steadiness I recognized instantly, and I trusted her without hesitation. By the time Marcus arrived with his briefcase, everything was ready. A doctor to verify my mind. A nurse to witness my signature. A lawyer to make it legally permanent. For the first time in days, I felt like myself again. Not a patient, but a woman who builds things to last, so that no one can quietly tear them down later. He set his briefcase on the foot of the bed and spread the documents across the rolling tray, the same tray that had held 2 days of untouched hospital meals. In that moment, it became the most important desk I've ever signed at. One by one, he walked me through everything, calm and unhurried. My doctor on one side, Patricia on the other. First, the life insurance beneficiary change. My parents' names came off. In their place, Theo, and surprising even myself as I said it aloud, a caregiver relief fund I'd been meaning to establish at my own company for years, a small endowment for the aides who quietly burn themselves out caring for everyone else. Second, a new will, redirecting the rest of my estate the same way. Third, an order halting the automatic monthly payments covering my parents' assisted living. Fourth, formal withdrawal of the down payment funds for Renee's house, signed and dated before the wire transfer could clear. I read every page. I understood every page. Then I signed my name steady-handed, my doctor watching, Patricia witnessing, Marcus notarizing. No drama. No tears. Just the quiet scratch of a pen, rewriting my entire life so it finally pointed toward the people who had actually shown up. When the last signature dried, I sat back against the pillows feeling lighter than I had in years. I looked at the 3 of them and said the only sentence that captured it, I just signed my whole life over to the people who actually showed up. The rest of my family couldn't be bothered to visit. Patricia, who'd probably witnessed 100 quiet reckonings just like this one, simply nodded once, as if she'd seen this exact moment before and was glad, this time, to be standing on the right side of it. Marcus packed the signed, witnessed, notarized paperwork back into his briefcase, copies for me, originals filed where they belonged. At the door, he paused, something close to respect crossing his face. "It's done," he said. "It's clean. Nobody undoes this." Then he left, and the room fell quiet again. Just me, the monitor, and Theo, who'd stepped out for coffee and returned to find his entire family legally rearranged on a hospital tray and asked no questions at all. He understood, the way he always did, that some decisions explain themselves. I didn't call my parents to announce it. I didn't text the group chat. There was no urge to throw it in anyone's face. That's not who I am. And honestly, the entire point of doing it quietly and properly was that it never needed to depend on their reaction. It was simply true now, witnessed, filed, permanent, whether or not they ever found out. I closed my eyes. Somewhere across town, my mother was arranging a freshly unpacked kitchen, feeling blessed. My sister was fluffing throw pillows in a house she didn't yet know had quietly stopped being possible. And here I was, in the bed none of them had visited, finally, strangely, at peace. They'd find out eventually. People always do. A letter from the assisted living office. A flagged transaction at the bank. And then, only then, they would come. I was certain of it. The day the money stopped was the day they'd remember they had a daughter. I just intended to be well enough to sit upright when they walked through that door. I was right. It only took a few days. By the third day, I'd been moved out of intensive care into a standard room. The clot was stabilizing, the immediate danger behind me, though a long recovery and months of blood thinners still lay ahead. Theo visited daily after school, bringing real food and trashy magazines, and we talked more in those few days than we had in years. Two siblings discovering, far too late, that they genuinely liked each other. My parents still hadn't called. Renee still hadn't called. The silence that once felt like a wound now felt almost like a mercy, a quiet stretch before the storm I knew was coming. The storm arrived through the bank. My company's accountant, whom I'd looped in, confirmed the withdrawal had processed cleanly. The funds pulled back before reaching the title company handling Renee's closing. Somewhere, a loan officer was frowning at a screen. A title agent was making an uncomfortable phone call. My sister's brand new house, full of unpacked boxes and carefully arranged throw pillows, was quietly developing a hole in its foundation that no amount of pizza could patch over. I felt no triumph about it, and I want to be honest, because honesty is the only thing that makes a story like this worth telling. I felt something closer to grim, settled calm. The calm of someone watching a consequence she didn't create, but had finally stopped preventing. For 36 years I'd been the safety net. I'd simply stopped catching, and gravity was about to handle the rest. Marcus, my brother-in-law, not my attorney, was the first to feel it, because Marcus has always felt money before he feels anything else. He called Theo, not me, because apparently it still hadn't occurred to anyone to call the woman actually lying in the hospital. Theo put it on speaker, and we listened together, his eyebrows climbing with every sentence. The bank was saying the down payment never arrived. The closing was collapsing. The sellers were threatening to walk. Did Theo know anything? Was there some mix-up? Because Carolyn always came through. Carolyn was reliable. There it was again. Carolyn always comes through. The exact phrase my mother had used my entire life to mean she'd never once have to consider my needs. Theo, bless him, kept his voice perfectly flat and said he had no idea about my finances, and maybe they should ask me directly, who, he pointedly reminded Marcus, was still in the hospital. A telling pause followed. You could practically hear him remembering, with irritation, that I was sick, as though my illness had become an inconvenient obstacle to my usefulness. They still didn't understand. That's what struck me listening. Even now, with the money gone, nobody was worried about me. They were worried about what my absence was costing them. I want to ask you something, because I genuinely want to know. Have you ever realized your family valued what you provided more than they valued you? That what you thought was love was really just billing? If you have, tell me in the comments. You're not alone in that, and you were never wrong to feel the difference. Renee called me directly that evening, the first actual phone call from my sister since before I'd collapsed. For one foolish second, I let myself hope this was the call where she apologized, where she finally asked how I was doing, where she remembered she had a sister, and not just a benefactor. It wasn't. She didn't mention the ICU. She didn't ask how I felt. She got straight to it, her voice tight with a stress that had nothing to do with my lungs. Carolyn, is there some problem with the down payment? The bank says the money never came through and Marcus is panicking. We could lose the house. Did something happen with your account? Did something happen with your account? I lay there, for days after she'd left me on read while I might have been dying, and listened to my sister's only concern being whether my bank account was functioning properly. Something inside me finally let go, gently, without any pain at all. Renee, I said evenly, I called our parents 9 times from the ICU. You sent me a heart emoji and told me to rest up. Silence. What does that have to do with the house? She asked, and the genuine confusion in her voice told me everything I needed to know. She truly didn't connect the two. The version of me that nearly died and the version of me that funded her entire life existed as two completely separate people to her, and only one of them had ever interested her. It has everything to do with the house, I said. But I'm not explaining it over the phone. If you want to talk, all of you, you know where I am. You've had the address for 4 days. My mother started calling within the hour. Renee must have hung up and immediately panicked, because suddenly my phone, silent and dark through the worst 2 days of my life, wouldn't stop lighting up with her name. Once. Twice. 5 times. The very thing I'd begged for from the ICU days too late, and now that it had arrived, I felt nothing but cold, clean clarity. I let it ring out. I want to be clear. This wasn't spite, wasn't an eye for an eye. I simply had nothing left to say to her over the phone, and I knew exactly how that conversation would unfold. She talks. She reframes. She finds the angle where she's the wronged party and I'm the difficult one, and she does it so smoothly that I end up apologizing before I even remember what I was upset about. The phone is her natural habitat. No witnesses, no paper trail, just her voice and my old, trained instinct to soothe her. Not this time. If my mother wanted this conversation, she'd have it in person, in the room she hadn't bothered visiting, in front of people who'd watched me sign my name. She'd have it on my terms, where her voice was just a voice, and the documents were real, witnessed, and impossible to talk away. I turned the phone face down, looked at Theo, and said, "They're coming tomorrow. I can feel it." He nodded. "You want me here?" "Yes," I said. "And Marcus. I want this handled correctly." That night I prepared the only way I know how, by getting my facts in order and deciding in advance exactly who I was going to be. I asked Marcus to bring copies of everything in the morning: the beneficiary change, the new will, the halted payments, the withdrawal confirmation, not to brandish them at anyone, just to have them present, quiet and undeniable, so nothing I said could be dismissed as the ramblings of a sick woman. I called him that night, and he gave me one piece of advice I scribbled on the back of a hospital menu. Don't argue with them. Whatever your mother says, however she spins it, don't defend yourself, he said. The moment you argue, it stops being about truth and starts being about who's louder. And she's had 60 years of practice being loud. You don't need to win a fight. You just need to tell them what's already done, and let the paperwork say the rest. Don't argue. Let the paperwork say the rest. I lay in the dark rehearsing calm. I thought about every family confrontation I'd ever lost, every time my mother's certainty had bulldozed straight through my facts, every time I'd somehow walked away agreeing I was the problem. And I realized what had always defeated me wasn't her argument. It was my own desperate need for her approval. That need was what made me flinch, fold, apologize. But somewhere in that ICU bed, the need had simply evaporated. You cannot manipulate a person who's stopped hoping you'll finally love them correctly. For the first time in my life, I had nothing left for my mother to take. My father called late that night alone. I almost didn't answer. His name on the screen had never carried the same gravity as hers. But something made me pick up. His voice was small and rough, like a man who'd been sitting in the dark working up the courage. "Carolyn," he said. "Honey, Renee told us. About the hospital. How bad it really was." A long pause, an old man searching for words he'd never practiced using. "Is it true you called 9 times that first day?" I told him it was. He exhaled, shaky, and when he spoke again his voice cracked clean in half. I had my phone in my pocket the whole time. I felt it buzzing. I thought it was the moving company. "Your mother said, 'Don't worry about it, finish the couch, we'll check it later.' And I listened to her. I listened to her instead of my own daughter." He started crying, my quiet, undramatic father, a man I'd seen cry maybe twice in my entire life. "I almost lost you," he said, "and I was carrying a couch." I let him cry. I didn't rush to fix it for him the way I would have my whole life, but I wasn't cruel either, because my father's failure had always been cowardice, never cruelty. "There's a difference." "Dad," I finally said gently, "I'm okay. I'm going to be okay. But things are going to be different now. I need you to understand that before tomorrow." He was silent for a moment. Then he said the one thing that told me he was the only one who truly understood. "I know," he said. "I'm just glad you're alive to make them different. I'll be there in the morning. Whether she comes or not, I'm coming." They arrived the next morning, filing into my hospital room like a delegation. My mother led, naturally, carrying a grocery store bouquet wrapped in crinkling cellophane and wearing a smile so bright and so rehearsed I almost admired the craftsmanship of it. There was no apology in that smile. No fear, no shame, none of the haunted look that shadowed my father trailing behind her. She had decided, somewhere on the drive over, that the way to handle this was to skip past the last 5 days entirely, flooding the room with cheerfulness until everyone simply agreed to pretend along with her. She set the flowers down right on the tray table, directly over the spot where I'd signed everything away, leaned in, kissed my forehead, and said, "Oh, sweetheart, look at you. You gave us such a scare, but you're the strong one. I knew you'd pull through just fine." There it was. The sentence that had defined my entire life, delivered over a grocery store bouquet in front of my brother, my lawyer, and my visibly anxious sister and brother-in-law hovering near the door. "I knew you'd pull through fine," as though my survival had been a foregone conclusion, as though her absence had been an act of confidence rather than a verdict. And barely a breath later, before I'd even responded, she got to the real reason she'd come. "Now," she said, settling into the chair with the air of a woman about to fix a minor inconvenience, "Renee tells me there's some confusion with the bank, some mix-up with the house money. Let's just sort that out, shall we? I'm sure it's nothing we can't fix. Let's just sort that out." I looked at her bright, expectant face and understood she genuinely had no idea what was coming. I didn't raise my voice. I want you to picture this moment clearly, because it's the whole of who I chose to become in that room. My mother had just glided past my near-death and gone straight for the money, in front of witnesses, and every instinct I'd ever been raised with screamed at me to either soothe her or scream at her. I did neither. I gently moved the bouquet off the tray table and nodded to Marcus, who stepped forward and laid a small stack of papers down in the space where the flowers had been. Then I folded my hands and told them, quietly, exactly what I'd done. I told them that on the second day in this hospital, when none of them had come, none of them had called, I'd asked my attorney to meet me here. I told them I'd removed them as beneficiaries on my life insurance, that I'd rewritten my will, that I'd halted the automatic payments that had been quietly covering their assisted living for years, payments my mother, I was fairly certain, had simply assumed materialized from a pension or thin air, because she'd never once asked, and that I'd withdrawn the down payment for Renee's house before it could clear, which was exactly why the bank had nothing to give them. I said all of it in the flat, even tone I used delivering hard numbers to nervous clients. No venom. No theater. Just facts, laid down one at a time like coins on a counter. The room went completely silent. My mother's smile remained frozen on her face, but it had become hollow, a smile with nothing left behind it. Into that silence, I delivered the one line I'd allowed myself to prepare, the truest sentence I have ever spoken to her. "I called you 9 times from this bed. You showed up for the couch. So I changed everything from the bed you never visited." My mother shattered like a dropped plate, all at once in pieces. The frozen smile collapsed, and underneath it wasn't grief or shame. It was fury, hot and aimed directly at me. She stood. She called me cruel. She called this a punishment over a simple misunderstanding, insisted she'd had no idea it was serious, that my messages must have gotten lost, that I should have been clearer, as though 9 missed calls and the phrase intensive care unit were some riddle she couldn't reasonably be expected to solve. She called me ungrateful. And then she said the thing that confirmed everything. "You did this to us from a hospital bed? What kind of daughter plots against her own parents while she's lying in intensive care? Plots. As if surviving and then simply telling the truth were some elaborate conspiracy, as if the real crime in that room was my paperwork, and not her absence." I let her finish. Then Marcus, who'd been standing quietly by the window, spoke in the calm, unbothered tone of a man who has watched countless people discover that reality keeps receipts. Everything I'd signed had been executed properly. My physician had documented my full mental capacity in writing. 2 witnesses, the doctor and the nurse, had observed the signing. It was notarized, filed, entirely valid, with no legal grounds whatsoever to contest it. Patricia, who'd slipped in to check my four and lingered near the door, added her own quiet line. I witnessed it myself. She was clearer-headed than anyone else I've dealt with all week. My mother looked from Marcus to Patricia to the papers on the tray, and I watched her finally understand there was no angle left, no version of this story where she came out as the wronged party, no phone call left to talk her way through. "You called me strong," I said, still calm, "so you'd never have to show up." Well, I was strong enough to stop. Renee had been frozen by the door through all of it, and now the full weight of what was happening landed on her at once. She understood at last that the money for her house, the house with its unpacked boxes, its carefully arranged throw pillows, the kitchen our mother had so proudly photographed, had been mine all along, and it was gone, because she'd left me to die alone with a heart emoji. Her face crumpled. "You're taking my house," she whispered, real fear cracking through her voice, the fear of someone who has never once had to stand without a net beneath her. I looked at my sister and felt something unexpected. Not triumph. Something closer to sorrow, because I'd had a net of my own my entire life too, the net of being needed, and it had cost me just as much as her dependence was about to cost her. "I'm not taking anything, Renee," I said. "I'm simply not paying for it anymore." There's a difference, even if nobody in this family ever bothered teaching us what it was. Marcus, my brother-in-law, said nothing at all, which was its own small form of justice. Then I handed my sister back her own words, gently, the way you return something someone dropped without meaning to. "You called me the day the money stopped," I said. "Not the day I almost did." She had no answer for that. None of them did. The room sat in silence, the monitor steadily beeping out my heartbeat, strong now, steady now, the heartbeat none of them had cared enough to come and listen for when it actually mattered. My father sank into a corner chair with his face in his hands. Theo stood beside my bed, one hand resting on my shoulder. And for the first time in my entire life, standing in a room full of my family, I was not the one apologizing. I didn't leave them with nothing. I want to be clear about that, because I know the satisfying ending is the one where everyone gets exactly what they gave, and I understand the appeal. But that isn't who I am, and more importantly, I refuse to become that person. So before they left the room, I laid out the only path forward I was willing to offer. I told my parents I'd consider restoring a portion of the assisted living support, not the insurance, not the will, those were finished, already redirected to Theo and the fund I'd chosen, but the monthly care, the roof over their heads, I'd help with again under conditions. I had Marcus write the terms down so no one could later claim otherwise. First, they had to say, out loud and in plain words, that they had left me alone when I might have died. Not a vague apology, the actual truth. Second, whatever this family looked like going forward, it had to move in both directions. I was finished being a support beam holding up a house I was never invited inside of. If they wanted a daughter, they needed to be parents, which meant showing up when it was inconvenient, when there was nothing to gain, when it was simply love and a hospital chair at 3 a.m. My father signed before I'd even finished explaining, his hand trembling. He stayed that night in the stiff vinyl chair beside Theo's, 2 men keeping watch over a daughter and sister they'd nearly lost. My mother took the longest. She stood by the window, arms crossed, for what felt like a very long time, and I genuinely didn't know if she was capable of it. But the paperwork was real and the witnesses were real, and for the first time in her life, there was no version of events that left her standing in the right. Finally, stiffly, not quite meeting my eyes, she said it. I should have come. 3 small words. They cost her more than anything she'd ever given me. It wasn't the mother I'd spent a lifetime wishing for. But it was true, and it was at least a beginning. At 36 years old, with a clot still dissolving somewhere in my lung and my brother asleep in a chair beside me, I decided a true beginning was enough to build something on. Renee eventually bought a smaller house with her own money, and I went home, finally, to a life I had quietly rewritten, one that pointed, at last, toward the people who'd actually stood in the room when it counted. Family was never measured by blood. It's measured by who walks through the door when the machines are beeping, and there's nothing left to gain by showing up. If you made it this far, you already understand that particular ache, the ache of being the strong one nobody ever bothers checking on. 9 unanswered calls. A couch that mattered more than a daughter. A lawyer summoned to an ICU bed. Maybe you've been the beam holding up a house you were never welcomed into. If this story gave you even a little strength tonight, tell me in the comments who actually showed up for you when it counted most. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you believe the people who quietly hold everyone else together deserve, at least once, to be the ones who get held, stay with us, because there's always another story like this one waiting to be told.